Yo, what up, squat farmers? It's your boy, Ryan Fun, back for another video, except today we're going to be talking about grants, specifically federal funding, more specifically university grants, or even more specifically, maybe University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. But it's still relevant even if you don't go to school there. So let's get started. Boom. The first thing that we're going to look at is this video by John Oliver and DOGE. I don't know why it got cut off, so that last letter of their name for whatever reason, but you can just ignore that. We're going to watch that real quick.
All research is now threatened, especially because, in addition to these cuts, this administration has a disastrous new proposal to cap what are sometimes called indirect research costs. Here is a DOGE guy in a group interview with Elon explaining the rationale.
So if I take NIH as an example, today, if you're an NIH researcher and you get a $100 grant at your university, today you get to spend 60 of that and your university spends 40 of that. The policy that we're proposing to make is that you get to spend 85 of that and your university spends 15. So that's more money going directly to the scientists who are discovering new cures.
What he just said there is extremely misleading. For starters, indirect costs don't come out of grants to researchers, they're issued on top of them. Essentially, right now, if you get $100 to fund your research, your university gets an additional $40. Under this new plan, that $40 would be capped at $15.
Okay, so now that that's over with, it's worth pointing out that they have two different ideas of how federal funding works. And one says it's like part of the researcher and they have to split it up, and then one says it's on top, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And somehow you'll see they're both right, but they're also both wrong. So let's get into it. First of all, what is a grant? Well, let's say you're a researcher with big dreams of studying living dinosaurs, and there's just one problem. You're broke. Now, luckily for you, you have a PhD, you work in a university as a professor, and universities are rich. Unfortunately, universities are not as rich as you once thought. There's a lot of people just like you who also want money for things that aren't just related to dinosaurs. The university doesn't really have money to spare for everyone. However, there's another solution: taxpayer money. See, the government has these agencies which exist in part to help you achieve your dreams as a soon-to-be professional dinosaur researcher. These agencies have these cool things called grants. The government puts out the grants, and if you apply to one of them by saying why you want the free money and how exactly you'll spend it, they might accept your application and give you the money for free to do your dinosaur studies. Woohoo! This is what happens when you're granted or awarded the money. So knowing that, we also have to know that the government gives two types of funding for grants: direct and indirect money. So direct is paying the researcher directly for the research. Most of the money that a grant gives for a researcher goes to direct. And this includes data collection, lab equipment, the paycheck for the researcher themselves, or plane tickets to fly to where the research is taking place. Like you have to fly to Jurassic Park if you want to study the dinosaurs, right? And more. Now, the second type is indirect. Indirect is paying the university indirectly for the research. So the amount of money a grant awards for indirect needs is based on a few things, but they'll never ever give more money to the indirect needs than to the direct needs, as the indirect is always some part of the direct payment that the government gives. Payments by the government that go towards indirect needs are split into two places: facilities and administrative. So they give this, some of the money will go to facilities. That lets the places that people can do the research in, like the laboratories, actually exist. This is the maintenance of the buildings, this is keeping the lights on, and so on. Then the second part is administrative. This is payroll for all the people that help keep the research going. So think of janitors, interns, just kidding, interns don't get paid. People that keep track of every dollar that some university spends, and so on. And it is not cheap. This is really important. It's not cheap to run a massive warehouse or a series of buildings to do research at a large university. So even if only a little bit of money from every grant goes towards the indirect needs of the university, when all of it's added up, it's a lot of money, and it helps keep the university afloat so that they continue doing important research. So now we talk about what is a rate. Well, the amount of money that a granting agency gives for anything that is going indirectly for the research is determined by a rate, or a percentage of the direct research money given to the university for the research. For example, if a researcher obtains a grant where the amount of money they get to spend on their research directly is $100,000 and the indirect rate is 15%, then the university gets $15,000 to go towards their buildings and payroll. So how is the indirect rate determined? This is where things start to get fun. You see, it's not a simple standard number across the board at all. So every granting agency can decide for each grant how they want to split the amount of money they'll give the researcher and how much they'll give to the researcher's university for direct and indirect needs. Sometimes the agency will state in their grant exactly what percentage of the direct money they're willing to give to the buildings and payroll. Other times, they just don't. And when the grantor doesn't say how much money they'll be giving to the indirect needs of the university turns to their trusty tables. So let's take a look at indirect rates at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. If you get a grant where the agency doesn't specify what percentage of the direct money will be given to indirect needs, then you consult this table. Some people ran some numbers and yapped with the federal government until both parties agreed upon these numbers. This system is needed because as universities take on more projects, the cost of keeping everything else going to support the research goes up too. With these rates, it's much more manageable for the university to sustain research. These percentages don't cover all of the money that the university is spending on facilities and administrative needs right now. Otherwise, the university would have to spend boatloads of money on their payroll and their electricity, more than they already are. As an example, if a researcher is given $100 from a grant to be spent directly and does their work in an on-campus lab, the university also gets $58.60 to be put towards buildings and payroll. This is how John Oliver explained federal grants. You get the $100, then you add the money on top of it. Okay. Now, it's not always so simple. So we've established what to do when the grantor tells the researcher how much money can be spent directly on the research. But what happens when the agency only lists a total budget for the grant? Now things start to get complicated. Here's a real example. This grant said application budgets, need to reflect the needs, whatever. It should not exceed $1.5 million in total costs, direct and indirect. So together, they need to add to the total. Let's look at a grant, hypothetically, where the total budget is $100,000. So remember how I said that in order to be accepted for grant money, the researcher has to show exactly how they'll spend the direct money themselves? Well, in order to figure out how you'll spend your money, you have to know how much you can spend in the first place. And since the indirect rate is always based on some percentage of the direct spending, whether that's determined by the grantor or by the university, you can't just look at the budget's total award anymore and add on a percentage bonus for indirect money from there. Previously, the research grant you may have gotten for dinosaur spending would be directly $100,000, and that meant you could spend $100,000 on the research itself. Now the grantor is telling you that this $100,000 has to pay for everything, direct and indirect needs. So, as an example, say you have a budget for $100,000, and the grantor says to look at your university's rates to determine your indirect needs. So you pull up your rates, and for this type of research, let's say the table says 60% of direct spending will have to go towards indirect needs. So all you have to do is figure out the following math. What two numbers add to your total budget and have one number being 60% of the other number? Well, that's a lot of work, so you pull out your trusty spending calculator, and it gives you this. Those are really not pretty numbers. What happened? Isn't 60% of $100,000 just $60,000? So when you get $60,000 for indirect needs and $40,000 for direct needs, well, you forgot one thing. The indirect funds are 60% of the direct funds, not 60% of the total budget. So these calculators exist because it's not easy math. You have to make sure that your indirect funding is exactly equal to 60% of your direct funding and that both numbers add perfectly to the total budget. This is how DOGE explained grants. When you have $100 total and you have whatever 85-15 or 60-40 that they wanted to pull out from nowhere, this is how they were talking about the grants. You have to add up to the total with the direct and indirect. Now, when a researcher applies for a grant, they have to know whether the agency is giving out that much money for direct costs or if the listed fund is for the total budget, where some of the awarded money goes to the indirect research needs of the university. This way, the researcher knows which type of cost structure they're doing. John Oliver's method or how DOGE explained it. You figured out your spending and you got the grant. Good job. Your hard work, ambitious drive, and skilled calculations have gotten you the grant. And you already planned out how you'd spend the money when you applied, so let's get rolling. Well, the first step should be to get all your awarded money from the government, right? Not so simple, just like everything else with grants. Sometimes the government decides to pay the researcher back every so often for what's been spent up until that point. This is called a reimbursement. So let's talk about reimbursements with an asterisk. This is really oversimplified. So you get a grant to do some research on dinosaurs, and the government gave you a year to complete the work, and it's been a month so far. And you spent $100 using the university's credit card during this month. Let's also say it's been decided that the government will reimburse you for your grant spending in monthly payments. Next, you or someone at your university, that person who would be getting paid via indirect funding, submits to the federal government, "Hi, our researcher spent $100 on direct costs this month on these items." And the government goes, "Yup, looks good to us." And the granting agency wires the university $100. Now, let's say the specific research has a 60% indirect funding rate. So the government throws in an extra $60 to help the university keep the lights on and the people paid. Great. This process repeats every month until the direct money has all been perfectly spent at the end of the agreed contract time length, and thus both the direct and indirect spending will have been completely reimbursed. Now, let's talk about DOGE's argument. Now we've gotten through all the necessary context, we can start getting into what DOGE is arguing. They're claiming that the vast majority of government-granted money should be going to the researchers' direct needs, otherwise known as direct costs. Right now, DOGE is noticing that for every $1 a researcher spends to do the research, the government also has to pay up to another 60 cents just to support the payroll in the buildings. And DOGE is saying, nah guys, we want to pay for the people doing the research. We are not paying any building costs. Figure it out yourself, universities. And the universities are saying, whoa. How do you expect us to pay for all these indirect needs when we have so many projects going on at the same time? That indirect money that we get from these funds right now adds up. So what does DOGE want to change? Well, they decided that changes need to be made. They were not convinced by the university's argument, and they tried in February to immediately stop any current and future grants at the Government Health Agency, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, that have an indirect cost rate of anything above 15% of the direct spending awarded. Reimbursements for these grants were put on hold, even where researchers had already spent university money and needed to be paid back for it. So, going forward, DOGE wants all future grants from the NIH to have 15% direct spending go towards indirect spending at most. This is the indirect cost rate cap you may have heard about, a limit on the percentage of direct funding that can go towards the facilities and administrative costs. A judge then told DOGE, you can't do that after they were sued, and the judge made DOGE give the reimbursement money they owed to the universities. And in the following months, DOGE was like, okay, well, if you think so, that we can't do that on the NIH, we'll just do it on the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation. Haha! We got more agencies that do the same granting process that we're just going to make them all 15%, and you have to stop them all one by one. So, about your dinosaurs. Let's say your dinosaur research grant would have been $100,000 total budget with a 60% indirect rate. You as the researcher would pull out your calculator and see that you get to spend $62,500 on direct costs, and the university would get $37,500 for their buildings and payroll. If DOGE were to have their way, everything would stay the same, except the 60% indirect rate would become 15%. Now you get to spend $87,000 to do your work, the university receives only $13,000 for payroll and building needs, and thus the university has to make up the difference and spend an extra $24,500 towards the indirect costs of this specific university research, just for this one grant. Now, the American taxpayer here is not seeing any cost savings. The grant totals $200,000 before the 15% rate limit, and it's still $100,000 after the 15% rate limit. So DOGE's argument for why these types of grants should be changed is that they want a lower percentage of taxpayer money to go towards things that aren't directly benefiting the research. Let's talk about the other scenario. In the other scenario, or cost structure, as I'll call it, the government lists their grant at $100,000 for direct costs, and it's up to the university to negotiate the prices and make their tables. Now, under DOGE's ideal world, the grantor has no choice but to make the indirect rate 15%, and not whatever the university negotiates it at. So here, you would still get your $100,000 for direct costs, but your university would be getting $15,000 instead of $60,000 to go to indirect needs. Again, the university has to make up the difference. In this scenario, the researcher is still getting the same amount of money to do their research, but the university is getting less. DOGE's argument here is that the American people shouldn't be footing the bill for indirect needs. The university should be responsible for keeping their own lights on, and it's not the government's job to do that. This is where all the money DOGE says the indirect funding limit will save comes from. Well, as we said at the start, universities are rich, right? They should be able to pay for all of this. Surely, they can pay their own people. They can keep their own buildings running. We don't need to pay these indirect costs for the research. Well, the university did some math. They wondered the same thing. And if every single grant that was awarded to researchers across just the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in fiscal year 2024 that had above 15% indirect rate was forced to pay 15%, then the University of Illinois would have to make up over $82.3 million in indirect funding just in those 12 months. So I guess people and buildings are expensive, huh? Who would have thought? Well, if DOGE gets their way, the university just can't afford to pay for all these buildings and researchers anymore. They may have to let people go. And it's not like they can keep taking in a ton of grants. And because with each grant the researcher gets, that's more work for the team behind the scenes to input every expense for it, to clean these research centers and labs and whatever. So if there's more work for those people, It means more spending from the university to maintain that. So now, every university and department within each university would have to pick and choose carefully what research to apply to, and if this were added up across the board, we're losing tons of research output as a nation. Just like indirect needs, it adds up. But does research really matter? So we've seen all the funding that's been going towards research that DOGE would call waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, if these changes are enacted by DOGE, then universities will become more careful in what research they choose to take on, and thus our dear taxpayer money will be better spent. It's a good argument. Let's say it's true. Let's say all this research, whatever, you don't like it. Well, there just isn't $82.3 million at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign alone annually for research to these bad causes. There just can't be $82.3 million worth of waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Important work would have to be stopped, or more accurately, it would just never get funded in the first place, assuming that judges don't block DOGE's proposals. And that is the problem with DOGE's proposed indirect cost rate cap. Universities need to have a significant amount of money from each grant go towards their buildings and their payroll. And changing that to a relatively small amount of money going towards indirect research needs will lead to the loss of valuable and potentially life-saving research. Of course, if you never fund it in the first place, you can't know what might have been. And that's all. Thanks for watching, everybody. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, but I'm not very qualified, so I don't know. Later.